welcome to this bonus episode of The Nation Speaks. Last week, the Nation Speaks team was at the Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, in Orlando, Florida. And there we spoke to a lot of thought leaders and up-and-comers in the conservative movement. Today, we bring you a few of those great conversations we had, where we talked a lot about how conservatives can come together and return to traditional American values. Joining us in this special episode are former HUD Secretary, Dr. Ben Carson, former Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, Andrew Wheeler, and current representatives, including NFL star Burgess Owens from Utah, Jim Banks from Indiana, and Idaho Representative Tammy Nichols. I'm here with Dr. Ben Carson, the former HUD Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, now that you're out of office, you're starting a think tank, and a conservative think tank, American Cornerstone Institute. What are going to be the priorities of this?
Well, first of all, I call it a think tank and a do tank. We're going to do stuff. But, the real priority is to get us back to those foundational principles that made us into a great nation. We seem to be burying those things like our faith. This country was founded on Judeo-Christian values, which taught us how to relate to our fellow man. It didn't teach us to cancel people we disagree with. We've just gotten so far away from that fundamental. And from liberty, people came here from all over the world in order to be able to lead the life that they wanted to lead without having somebody interfering and trying to control everything that they were doing. And we need to make sure that people fully understand that loss of our freedom is something that's serious, and it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's big tech and the media quashing the willingness of people to speak out, that's loss of freedom of speech. And if the government condones it, it is that much more worse. That's what's going on. We need to expose that and help people to really understand that. And then the whole concept of community. We became a strong nation because we were communities. We helped each other. We worked together. If a farmer broke his leg at harvest time, everybody harvested his crops for him. They didn't ask him what his political party was. That is changing. Now we have a situation where that neighbor who's been across the street for 20 years, peacefully living there, we let the politicians and the media convince us that they're our enemy because they have a different yard sign than you do. Where does that naturally lead? It does not lead to strength. It leads us to weakness. It leads us to vulnerability. And then life. As we abandon our respect for life from the womb to the tomb, we become much more callous and coarse in the way that we react with each other. And you can see that manifested throughout our society. And we need to start at a young age. This summer we'll be launching a program called Little Patriots. And we want to teach our young people the wonderful things about our nation. We want them to be proud of our nation and patriotic. And, it was Karl Marx who said, give me your young people for 3 or 4 years and I'll have them for life. Well, we need to take that to heart. And we need to make sure we begin to teach them at a young age what the right things are.
So let me ask you, you were secretary for 4 years. You came in as an outsider. How did that experience of being in the center of government change your views on things?
Well, first of all, I have to say there are some good people in government. Contrary to what many people might think, there are some people who are dedicated public servants. And I was very happy to work with those people. But there are also a lot of swamp creatures on both sides of the aisle, by the way. We should not kid ourselves and think they're all on only one side. And they want to maintain the status quo, and they want to maintain their power, and they're less interested in what works for the people. That's problematic, and I learned that, and you have to figure that into everything that you're doing. But one of the things that is very helpful in dealing with swamp creatures is shining the light on them. And we have to keep the spotlight on them. Sometimes that will even help to change them. But if you allow them to do what they're doing without notice, it can be pretty sinister.
Do you think that's happening? Feels like there hasn't been enough light being shone.
Oh, there's no question that it's happening. And the unfortunate thing is that the media has been complicit with it. The reason it had a more difficult time happening in the past is because there was a lot more integrity in the media. But the media does not recognize that the first thing that socialists and communists do is control the media. They're slicing their own throats by siding with people who are antithetical to the principles of America.
Absolutely. So looking at American Cornerstone Institute, it seems like a lot of your focus is going to be on at the local level. Is that right?
Well, one of the things I discovered as HUD secretary is that we could make a lot of progress by going to the different localities around the country and doing town forums and roundtables and bringing everybody to the table from all the different sides, but putting the facts in the middle of the table and saying, let's solve this based on the evidence, not on ideology, not on how you wish things should be, but let's look at the facts and let's work with those. So for instance, we were making enormous progress in Los Angeles with the homelessness problem because they are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every year on each homeless person with little to show for it. And when you put the facts on the table, you discover very quickly that the costs are enormous there because of all the regulatory barriers that you have to comply with, and that there are other ways to achieve the results without all those expensive regulatory barriers. Those are the kinds of things that will allow us to make progress. And, we the American people are not each other's enemies. And nothing is accomplished by us getting in our respective corners and throwing hand grenades at each other. But we can only accomplish it if we're willing to talk. It's like marriage. In the beginning, you can't keep your hands off of each other. You talk about everything. You don't want to be away from each other. And by the time they're ready to get divorced, they don't talk to each other. And the next thing you know, their spouse is the devil incarnate.
I understand. So while I have you here and being obviously a doctor, what do you think? Do you think we're doing the right things with COVID right now?
We've made tremendous progress with COVID. In fact, the incidence of new infections and hospitalizations is down well over 70%. Just in the last few weeks, it's plummeting, which means we're doing the right things. We're developing herd immunity. The vaccinations are getting out there. It's absolutely wonderful. You're not hearing that from most of the media, you notice, because they want to maintain the narrative that this is a severe problem. We're all going to die, and unless we pass this $1.9 trillion bloated bill, we're going to be in big trouble. And it's so sad that we're that dishonest with people.
So what do you think our policy should be at this stage?
Well, at this stage, obviously, we should be continuing to push the vaccinations, get them done as quickly as we possible, and we should be concentrating on how we open up quickly, how we get people back in school, how we resume normalcy. We're very close to being able to do that. We need to go ahead and do it.
And I know one of the, you can let me know, for the American, for your think tank, your do tank, yeah. American Cornerstone Institute, that vote integrity will be one of the things that you're looking at. Is that right? That is a
big factor because, a lot of people on the conservative side are saying, well, things are going to change in 2022 and we're going to take back the House. You're not going to take back anything if you don't fix this voting system ever again. And, we have to, there was a reason that our Constitution was written. There's a reason that it says that changes in voting have to be done by the legislature of that state and has to be done in a timely fashion, not 3 weeks before an election. If you have secretaries of state and people like that saying, well, we don't have to really worry whether the signatures match. Well, we don't really have to worry about whether they're in on time. We don't really have to worry about whether they were folded or not, indicating that they weren't really mailed in, or that they were received actually before voting started. None of that stuff really matters. That's craziness. And it is disenfranchising the American people. the whole concept of one person, one vote is just going out of the window when we do silly stuff like that.
Well, we've got to wrap up now. Thank you so much, Secretary Carson, for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm here with Andrew Wheeler, the former administrator of the EPA, and before that, the deputy administrator, so a long time serving the EPA and the Trump administration. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I heard part of your speech earlier here at CPAC, and I want to ask you just a few questions about that. One of the things you said is that under the Trump administration, he collected more in fees, violations, than under the Obama administration. What were most of those for?
A lot of them were, well, actually across the board. We enforced all of the environmental statutes, quite a few under Superfund. Some of the bigger ones were under the Clean Air Act, having to do with some tampering of cars by some of the auto manufacturers on the emissions control equipment. So we enforced all the laws under President Trump.
And also, okay, moving to the Paris Accord that you're also talking about, Biden administration's going back into the Paris Climate Accord, and you mentioned that the U.S. has reduced its CO2 emissions more than any of our partners. So I guess the question is, since the Paris Accord isn't actually binding, is there a harm in going back in?
Well, there is a harm in that it gives legitimacy to countries like China who aren't doing anything to reduce their CO2 emissions and don't have to start until 2030. It also requires a lot of funding of different organizations and other countries around the world, many of whom aren't doing anything either. So it's going to be a hit to the American taxpayer, and it's can be a hit to the American jobs too.
Do you think there's any international agreement that would actually be useful to enter related to this, maybe to hold China to account, or can you imagine anything, or is your vision that U.S. should just, take care of its own environmental policies?
Well, climate change in particular is a global issue, and there needs to be more investment in technologies and research, and I think exporting those technologies to other countries can help the overall addressing climate change. We are leading by example. We've reduced our CO2 emissions 12% since 2005. Under the Trump administration at the EPA alone, we put forward 4 new regulations to reduce greenhouse gases. So we are leading by example, as we always do on environmental standards and environmental regulations.
Can you briefly outline what those 4?
Sure. So we move forward with regulations addressing CO2 emissions from automobiles. From the airplane sector, the first time ever the airplane sector has ever had greenhouse gas reductions, our methane reductions from the natural gas sector as well. So, we really did a lot to reduce greenhouse gases across the board.
I don't believe those were covered all that much in the media.
No, they weren't. They were not covered. Neither was the fact that all of our environmental indicators improved under President Trump. The air today is 7% cleaner than it was when he took office. Water levels, highest quality in decades. On Superfund, we cleaned up more Superfund sites than in a generation. We set a record. We cleaned up as many in one term as the Obama-Biden administration did in 2 terms. And then we already mentioned the enforcement side, where we collected twice as much in civil and criminal enforcement fines as the Obama administration did during their first 4 years.
It's impressive. So what was when you came into the job, what was the mandate that President Trump gave to you?
When he called me and he asked me to take over at EPA, he said, I want you to continue to clean up the air, continue to clean up the water, and continue to deregulate in order to help create more jobs. And we did all 3 at the same time. And in fact, I believe that we proved for the first time ever that you can have cleaner environmental indicators and have less burden on the American economy at the same time. That's never actually been proven before until we did it across the board under all of our statutes.
Very interesting. So on the topic of American jobs, if the Biden administration is cutting the Keystone Pipeline and cut fossil fuel extraction, all of this, and it seems to be that the theory seems to be that green energy jobs will replace those jobs. Do you think that's possible? What's your view on that?
No, it's not possible. And even more importantly, having the American energy dominance that we have at the end of the Trump administration doesn't just help American consumers, American families with lower costs of energy, but also brings back more manufacturing jobs to the U.S. And when we don't have those jobs, when we don't provide, for example, the natural gas to our allies, it's being provided by other countries who have horrible environmental records and horrible environmental regulations. When we produce the fossil fuels here, when we produce the jobs here, we're meeting the toughest environmental regulations anywhere in the world. And when we don't do it, it goes to places like China where they don't have the same environmental controls.
Right.
So it's horrible for the horrible for the entire world environment, and it really does hurt American consumers and American jobs.
It makes a lot of sense because it's still going to happen somewhere.
Exactly.
Somewhere with a lot less
stringent regulations. It can either happen here where we have the regulations to ensure it's clean, or it happens somewhere else where it's not.
Interesting. And maybe you can give me your analysis of what happened in Texas recently.
Yes, Texas. I think it's going to take us a while to figure out everything, all the ramifications for what happened in Texas. From what I can tell and what I understand, first of all, it was a once in a century storm, but apparently the equipment wasn't properly winterized. They weren't expecting a storm of that magnitude, and the temperatures of that magnitude. Their equipment was not properly winterized. They were more dependent on wind than they should have been. They really need to have more baseload generation, and Texas has been moving away from that in recent years. And what we have found, when we have large economies, we need to have multiple choices as far as energy supply. We need to have all of the above. We need to have baseload generation. We need to have more nuclear. We need to continue to have natural gas. We need coal as well. But we also do need wind and solar. We need all forms of energy. But most people don't recognize that every form of energy has pluses and negatives, including renewables. They gloss over the negatives on the renewable side. The only energy form that I can think of that doesn't have a negative impact would be geothermal, and that's probably just because we don't use it as much. We haven't discovered what the negatives might be. But every form of energy, on the solar panels, they use a lot of hazardous materials in the production of solar panels and in the panels themselves. At the end of the lifespan, they have to be dealt with as hazardous materials and not just sent to the city municipal's waste dump. The wind power does horrible things to migratory birds as well as bats. Natural gas, fossil fuels, we know what those issues are, but there's also benefits and positives to them. And one of them is energy security and having that baseload generation that we need when people want to turn on their light switch or turn up the thermostat in the winter or turn it down in the summer. We need to have that electricity to power the country.
You said about the windmills makes me think of like the 2011 tsunami in Japan, where they had, brakes for tsunamis, but the waves, went way over them. And now
Yes.
they're building, much bigger wind breaks, tsunami breaks. So do you think the solution is for Texas or others like it, rely less on wind or make sure it's winterized? What do you think should be the lessons from this?
I think the lessons, they need to do a thorough investigation on what happened. But to winterize the equipment better, make sure that it can withstand when it's needed the most. The electricity, most Americans take it for granted. So many countries in the world, they can't take their electricity for granted. It's not always there when they turn on the switch. We take it for granted here, and we've been pushing the grid, the resiliency of the grid to its outer limits. And we need to make sure that we have all forms of energy so that when one does go down, when there is a problem. I grew up in Ohio, and I remember in the late 70s, my school district shut down for 6 weeks in the middle of the winter because it was so cold and they couldn't get the natural gas shipments into that area of the state. So we had to shut down for 6 weeks. Every form of energy has positives and negatives, and we need to recognize that and plan for that.
Recently, a judge vacated the Trump administration's your rule, on limiting which scientific
or science transparency
rule.
Yes.
Can you explain what that was and what it means that it was struck down?
It's horrible that it was struck down. And all we did was say that when the agency uses a scientific study as a basis for a regulation, if to the extent possible, we have to make that data available to the public so that the public knows which studies we're using and that they can look at the data. And there were plenty of off-ramps that if the data was not available, it didn't have to be made. If the study was still important, the administrator could exempt the requirements for data availability. There are plenty of safeguards. There's not a single study in the past 50 years that would have, which EPA is 50 years old, was not a single study in the last 50 years that would have been banned from being used under our science transparency. It was all about trying to provide more information to the American public, because I think at the end of the day, when we explain to the American public the basis for our regulations, there'd be better acceptance and understanding of what the agency is doing and why we're doing it.
That seems like a common sense rule to put in place. What was the judge's reasoning?
He remanded it back to the agency on procedural grounds, saying that we used the wrong authority, which I disagree with. This is an activist judge in Montana who struck down this regulation for the entire country. And if I were still at the agency, we would of course be defending and appealing that decision. The Biden administration has decided not to appeal the decision. Apparently they don't believe in community right to know or getting information out to the public.
So we have to wrap up, but very briefly, what is the current situation? If those studies don't have to be made public, are they sometimes anyway, or is just not practiced?
Sometimes they're made public, but what I was trying to do is take the regulatory decisions out of the proverbial smoke-filled back room and shed light and sunshine on the regulatory process, which was a tenet of President Trump across the board. You know, for the first time ever, all the EPA guidance documents are available in a searchable database. We discovered over 10,000, actually over 11,000 guidance documents that tell people what they have to do, but they were only available in filing cabinets in Washington, D.C. We put them on a searchable database, and at the same time we rescinded 1,000 of them, but we have 10,000 of those. So across the board, we were trying to shed more sunlight into what regulatory agencies like the EPA does, because it impacts every American's life every day, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew what we were doing and why we were doing it.
Sounds like makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I'm here with Congressman Burgess Owens from Tallahassee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. I grew up actually 4 hours away from here. Went to school 4 hours south of here in University of Miami, and now in Utah and loving it, and just thankful to be back in my state of Florida for sure.
And you were mentioning you think it would be a good idea for CPAC to move here permanently?
Absolutely. No, this is what it's all about. Leave the cold north, come down, enjoy ourselves. It's an open state. It's a place where we feel safe and able to do our thing, and I love that. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to years to come. The CPAC stay here, remain here.
It's definitely showcased itself well.
It really has, for sure.
So I wanted to ask you, as a former NHL player and a Super Bowl champion, what do you think the proper role? Do you think it's proper? Everything's become political. Let's start there. Everything's become political. Politics is everywhere. So what do you think should be the role of politics in sports or not?
Very simple. First of all, we have to understand what has made us the great country we are. We're a place of diversity. We have people who think differently about how we get to the end game. The thing we've always had in common is that we have the same end game. So whether it be our kids having a good education, our ability to go out and have a big business and enjoy ourselves, to retire one day, that's the end game no matter what side of the aisle we're on. What keeps us united are those things we have in common. What we've had in common in the past is our Judeo-Christian values. Starting off, we believe in God. No matter how we worship Him, we believe in God. We do believe that every kid should be educated. We do believe that families are important, and we do believe also that the free market is a good option. We've used things like sports, our flag, our national anthem, to unite us. No matter how we might differ on a political process, we show up to a football game, and we root for the same team, and we can leave there high-fiving each other because we have something in common. What is disgusting to me is when we have people in a position to unite us and they use their positions to divide us. Football should never, ever, and basketball should never, ever be political, because you're turning off, you're turning down, you're demeaning half your fan base. So all it says is that those who are doing it do not respect their fan base. The Roger Goodell's who care less about most of the people in his audience, because he wants to dig in and divide our nation. And he uses young men who don't understand a lot of the things that's going on. So many of our young boys today, young men, who are now making millions of dollars a year, never grew up pledging the flag, never grew up saying a prayer. 70% of them don't have dads because of the policies that have been put in place that's destroyed the family unit. So you get a young person like that who has not been taught to love our country. He's going to stand on the sideline and not love his country. And all he has to do is give a platform that the Goodell has given them, and it makes it a bigger deal, and it divides our nation. In the old days, because they were more concerned about the American brand, they would have said, if you want to do that, do it on your own time. Yes, you have 6 months out of the year to do whatever you want to. You have time off. You're making millions of dollars. Go for it. But when you're working for my team and you're representing my brand, you're going to respect my customers. You're going to respect the customers that are paying your salary. When we have leftists like Godell, who could care less about the American people, who care less about the American brand, they now have Kaepernick as the brand around the country. He's a Marxist. Now that plays well in China, which is where the NFL wants to move their teams and all that, but it doesn't play well for the American people. But it also shows what the priorities are. So I'm one of those Americans that will not watch another football game until Godell is fired.
Wow.
And then I'll still want to consider, because it's taking them too long and it's too much collusion for him to be doing what he's doing and nobody stand up against him. And the same thing with basketball. Listen, LeBron James making millions of dollars. He's making a lot of his money in China, all international. How about if he just 1 second, give the message, this is a great America, this is a great place to grow up. Young men, you can live this, you can do great in this country too. You don't have to be a basketball player. You just have to know how to work hard. You have to learn how to respect people. You have to be educated. And I'm going to put my money back in making sure that you know our country, that you are educated. When you leave high school, you can read and write. And then I'm going to put together with my teammates business opportunities so you can actually go out there and learn how to work, respect your employer, and maybe one day have a business of your own. That's the message that we should be giving as examples of our great American system. Unfortunately, the leftists have taken it and in a different direction. We're not getting that same message today.
Let me ask you, in the locker rooms, did you used to talk politics at all?
We didn't. And again, as young people, in the days I played, what we did is we'd come to the sideline, we'd put our hands over our hearts, and many of us would get teary-eyed as we sang our national anthem. Why? Because we're playing a game that we love, we're making relatively good income, and to come from where many of us have come from, that is a true blessing. But we were taught by a generation before us to count our blessings, and that's the difference. My generation has dropped the ball. My dad and mom's generation were remarkable Americans. They believed in meritocracy. They believed in respect of God, country, family, respect of women and authority. We had dads in the home. 70% of dads were in the home, making sure our young men understood that. If we didn't understand it, he would make sure that we understood it. And that's old school. We've lost that. And we've allowed policies by the left, by the Democratic Party, to upend our communities in so many ways. They've destroyed the family unit. They've demeaned womanhood. They've demeaned manhood. I'll tell you what, to have 70% or more of men not committing to the mothers of their children, in my day growing up, they would have simply called them a whiners, weenies, and wimps, period. There's no respect for people like that. But yet they're respected today because the media pushes these kind of people as their heroes. They will never allow a Clarence Thomas to be a hero, a Ben Carson to be a hero, a Burgess Owens, a Byron Donalds, who's also a Republican, black Republican in the Republican Party, black Republican. Because we represent a threat to those who want to keep us dependent. If we can think, we can ask the question why, if we can articulate ourselves, if we can go out and start a business, we don't have to depend on anybody else, that's a threat to the left. They want dependency, and everything they do is based on making sure that we're illiterate, that we're jobless, that we have no God, that we can think and connect ourselves to, that we see government as being the answers versus us starting our own business. Every part of that is about dependency and about power to the elitist class. So that's what we're up against. And I'm just thankful, to be honest with you, Cindy. I'm so thankful to have been elected at this particular time to be on the field of action, because we have a remarkable freshman team that we're going to do our best to hold the line in the next 2 years. As the American people see contrast, we will drift toward the light like we always have, and the left is not light, it's darkness, and we're going to get away from that.
So how are you going to show that contrast? Because it feels like one message gets through, one's to the media, another to
Well, what's beneficial about what's going on now is they show the contrast. Now that they own the House, the Senate, and the executive branch, their policy shows up. When you have a president, the first day comes in and writes with the stroke of his pen, there's 11,000 jobs of union people jobs, black, white, good jobs, middle-class jobs, and they're gone, disappearing.
Canceling the Keystone pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. They're about to cancel another pipeline. They're now allowing people come through the border in a way that we've never seen before, which actually depresses the pricing and the job opportunities for those Americans that are looking for jobs. I see a real political child abuse when you allow cartel to take kids children who have no idea where they're going, would not go on their own, but some kind of way they've been enticed or they've been stolen and taken across the border so that they can win. And the Democrats are okay with that. These are children that the parents will never ever see them again in most cases. These are children that are loved just like we love our kids. The Mexican people love their kids the same way. For us not to believe that, it means we got some issues. For those who believe that the parents of those children do not care about them, then we need to look outside ourselves, see who we are. So I call it political child abuse, to have so many millions of kids around this country that cannot go back to school because these teacher unions want to continue to move the goalposts. They want more money. They want more. They want to keep they want to keep making money, though they're not showing up to do their job. Right now, we put over $110 billion in the bill before the end of the year to make sure our schools are open. They're asking now for another $130 billion. The other parts have not been used, and the one that they're asking for won't be used until 2022. So they're not thinking about the kids; they're thinking about themselves. And what I'm hoping out of this, Cindy, to be honest with you, is American people can have a little bit more empathy when we talk about the black community that's been used like this for decades. When I say all we want is choice. We have kids that do not have a choice to get out of these terrible schools. They leave school not be able to read and write. And what are they going to do? They have no hope. They have no opportunity. Well, now you see how it feels. Let's go from sympathy to empathy. Every child in this country should have the choice for quality education. I don't care what zip code they live in. And every child, if the teachers won't teach them, either fire the teachers or put those children in another school where the teachers do care for them.
Well, I wish you luck because I think you're an excellent role model for probably all those kids coming from, slave stock playing the NHL. You had a business, it failed, you came back, now you're elected to Congress. It really is a remarkable story, and I think probably one that should inspire any American.
It's the American way, Cindy, and you know what? It's interesting. It happens all around us. Every one of us have somebody in our history. All we have to do is look into it that will inspire us to move forward. Because at the end of the day, the most magical 3 words, I won't say magical, the most powerful 3 words that one American can tell another is, if I can do it, you can do it. And as we go through our struggles, we overcome our struggles, yes, let's learn from them, but let's also share them so we can tell those words to give us, our fellow Americans, hope. And that's the American dream, that's the American way. If we do that, then we'll come out of this, and the dark left will not have a chance.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Cindy.
Pleasure.
I appreciate it. All the best.
I'm joined by Representative Jim Banks from Indiana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I know you're speaking at CPAC about the future of the Republican Party. Can we get a little insight into what you're thinking there? Yes.
By the way, what a great place to be in Florida, where Floridians are living their daily lives. The mask mandates aren't nearly as offensive here as they are in so many other places in the country. You have a state here that's working, and that what I'm going to talk about today with the future of the Republican Party really gets to the heart of what's going on here in Florida, a state that is moving on, growing their economy. More people are moving to Florida because they want to be a part of it. We're going to talk about where the party goes from here. I'm on the stage with Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, and I chair the Republican Study Committee, which is the largest conservative caucus in the Congress, about 150 Republicans in the Republican conference. And we've been spending a lot of time talking about what does our agenda look like moving forward? How can we build a Republican agenda that has consensus, that unifies Republicans? And I think that platform and agenda is really the Trump agenda. It's what President Trump fought for. It's why President Trump made the Republican Party the party of the working class again. And that's the agenda that we need to advance and advocate for if we're going to win the majority in 2022 and win the White House back in 2024.
And so are you already looking ahead at strategies for primaries for 2022 and how you'll run those campaigns?
Yes, we're a Republican Study Committee. We're focused on the policy, but the policy is good strategy. When we show the difference between where we are as a party, where I believe most Americans are in this country, versus the radical left that controls the Democrat Party today, we win elections when we show the difference. So I talk a lot to our members of the Republican Study Committee about the traditional conservative values of the party of Reagan, restoring our party to the party of fiscal responsibility, a strong national defense and peace through strength, and the pro-family party, the pro-life party. I mean, those are the core Reagan conservative values. But President Trump taught us a lot too, and we need to recognize, what did President Trump do to make the Republican Party the party of the working class? He renegotiated trade deals that put American workers first. He put the interest of blue-collar Americans over the interest of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. He tackled the China threat, both economically and militarily. The first president in my lifetime who's addressed China as the greatest existential threat that America faces today. That's why working men and women around the country became Republicans. They loved and supported President Trump. And if Republicans fail to recognize that and we backtrack away from those principles, we won't win elections in 2022 and 2024.
So of all the things that you said, the one that stood out to me was fiscal responsibility, because that's probably where the most criticism has come down, and all these huge spending bills now for the COVID recovery spending bills. So how do you think the Republican Party should tackle that one?
Well, I'm one Republican who's first to acknowledge that Republicans have lost their way when it comes to fiscal responsibility, just like Democrats have. But I can tell you, I've been in Washington for 4 years. The national debt when I got there was $21 trillion. Now we're, with the $2 trillion the Democrats passed last night, we were over $30 trillion in just a matter of time. So, and Republicans have been a part of some of that. I mean, I admit it. But every single spending deal that's come out of Washington in a decade or more, Democrats have demanded a lot more and Republicans have demanded less. So we have to recognize that. But if we're going to become the party of fiscal responsibility, we need to do what we say we're going to do, and advance budgets that are balanced, that are responsible, that put the future generations' interest front of center, front of mind in a way that Republicans haven't done before. So Republican Study Committee, this has always been really a legacy issue for RSC. We craft the most conservative budget that is introduced in Congress. We do it every single year. I led the effort last Congress. We've already started that effort. We have a task force that's developing a conservative budget, and we'll advance it in the next couple of months.
So is there a key highlight or two that you can share on how we're going to reduce that deficit?
Well, it's easy to do. I mean, you look at the massive overreach of the federal budget and spending in Washington. It's easy to find places, let me tell you, where you can cut back and cut senseless, wasteful spending at the federal level. But we also have to look at the drivers of the national debt and look at mandatory spending programs. How can we reform programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid so that they work for future Americans without going bankrupt and losing out on those programs for the Americans who need it the most? That's something that we believe in. We believe that's compassionate. We're compassionate to those who rely on those programs today, but we also want to see those programs last into the future and help Americans who need them. So those are issues that we tackle in the Republican Study Committee budget as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
I'm here with Tammy Nichols. She's a state legislator, House Representative in Idaho. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So I know there's a lot of issues that you're very passionate about and working hard on in Idaho, but one of them that caught my attention was what's going on with the universities. Can you explain what's going on there, I guess particularly with the University of Boise?
Yeah, so what we're seeing happening, and it's happening all over the nation, is that there are certain programs that are coming into our universities and colleges. Some might be familiar with the critical race theory, and you wouldn't think that would be happening in Idaho because Idaho's known for being a very red and conservative state, which we are. Just not in our government, it seems, or our colleges and universities. So yeah, we have our school, Boise State University, which is in Boise, Idaho, and we're finding out from students and parents that there's some concerns that are going on, and that's because they have been bringing in the diversity programs, the critical race theory programs, and it seems that it's creeping into our universities, and our students are now speaking out about it.
So what are the concerns that you're hearing?
Well, first of all, we're hearing that you have students that are going there for an education. They want to get an education to be able to be successful in whatever career path they choose, but instead they're having to take classes or do research papers or other assignments that have to do with their white privilege or have to do with things that they never did themselves, things that maybe their ancestors were involved in, and things on transgenderism, on appropriations. I mean, there's just a ramifications of all sorts for what's going on with the kids and the training that they're having to go through.
So when did this start that you're aware of?
So what happened with our university there is we had a president that was retiring, and there was an interim president that took his place. And towards the end of that, he wrote a letter that talked about bringing in these diversification programs and having separate graduations, like rainbow graduations and graduations for blacks and graduations, like separation, kind of going back to the 60s almost. And they were talking about changes that they were going to be making at the school, and that the new president that was getting ready to come on was on board with all of this. And so one of our legislators decided to write a letter because she started becoming concerned with what she was hearing. She told some of us, and we were of course concerned, and so there was I think 28 of us that signed on to this letter and sent it to the new president. And it kind of set off a firestorm. I did an interview later on, and I was asked on how we could change this. And I said, well, I think defunding is going to be the only way, because money talks, and these universities like to get their money. And I really felt that that was going to be the only way that we could actually send a message. So that's kind of where we're at now. And they're not too happy with us because they don't want to be defunded.
So what do you mean that's where we're at? What's the state of things?
Well, so in Idaho, the unfortunate thing is that all of the money that comes in from the state that we pay for the universities and colleges is in one pot. What we would like to do is separate that pot, because we don't want to burden our other universities and colleges that are doing a good job and actually teaching students. We don't want to create problems for them. We want to send a message to specific places that really are just doing things that Idahoans don't want to do. It's not the Idaho way of doing things in our state. We want our kids prepared. We want them to excel in their education. We want them to get an excellent education and be very productive in society. And so we don't want to punish the schools that are actually taking that initiative and doing that. We only want to send a message to the ones that aren't. So we have a couple of legislators that are trying to propose legislation to be able to separate that money into separate buckets, if you will, instead of having it all in one. And that way, if there's some defunding that needs to take place, we can target it specifically to the entity.
So what's the university's reaction at this point?
Well, there's been a lot of conversations between the president and different legislators, even some of their own donors, because we've had some of their donors coming to us that have donated millions of dollars to them, and they're stopping their donations because of what's transpiring, which you would think would send a message to the schools that maybe people aren't happy with what's going on, but it just seems like it makes them buckle down even harder. And so it seems that, well, it actually is, that they're just not making any changes. It's not creating an environment for them to have to feel like they need to change. So in the legislature this year, we're going to have to really look at what kind of money we're giving them. Now, granted, some of the programs that they're bringing in, the diversity trainings and the white privilege stuff, is paid for by student fees. And so that might be another way that we have to approach this, is by being able to allow the students to direct where their fees are going so that they're not paying for something that they don't want to participate in.
So are you hearing from students too that they're concerned about what's going on?
Yeah, actually just about a couple of weeks ago, we had several of the students from Boise State come and talk to us about their experiences, and the things that they were saying were pretty shocking. These are kids that are taking engineering programs. They're taking programs so that they can go into med school, and they were having to write papers on their white privilege, or they were teaching them in biology that there are no sexes, there are no genders, that everything is fluid. And these are kids that are going to become doctors and go into those fields, and they're not even teaching them the very basics of actual biology. One student was in engineering and was asked to write a paper on white privilege, and his professor actually told him, because he asked him, well, why do I have to do this? This has nothing to do with engineering. And his professor told him, because you're asking this question, you should actually be suspended from this university. So you just see these things creeping in, and there's no rhyme or reason for it. It has nothing to do with engineering, nothing to do with math, but we're seeing that creeping into all grades. So even our junior highs, our high schools, our grade schools, they're bringing in these diversity programs, the critical race theories, and bringing sex into the education system through different means.
So are you hearing from younger kids and parents too about what's going on in the grade?
Well, I still have kids in school, and so I'm very careful on what they are doing, what they're learning, and what they bring home. And my kids have been well trained to, keep an eye out for things like this. They know what to look for. And yeah, there have been some assignments. When at the beginning of this last school year, when my kids were finally back in school, had to do with blacks not being able to succeed in life because of white people. And so they gave them an article to read, and then they had to answer several questions on why it was the whites' fault, the white people's fault, that the black people weren't able to succeed. And talked nothing about, their environment. Maybe there's no father in the household. Maybe, the parents are on government programs, or just some, other things that you would just naturally, I think, bring into play to add to the conversation. It was very biased in what they said, and so another parent actually brought it to my attention, and so we both wrote the teacher and asked for an alternative assignment, that we did not feel this assignment was appropriate, and listing our reasons why. So yeah, we're seeing it everywhere.
And did you get an alternate assignment?
We did get an alternate assignment, yes.
Oh, interesting.
So
do you feel like
nice.
A lot of parents are paying more attention to what their kids are learning because of, COVID and all the homeschooling that was happening? And
I'm hoping so, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of parents that ended up homeschooling that never thought they were going to. But I hope parents are paying attention. They really need to. So much is done online now, so it makes it even harder, I think, because your kids aren't bringing home actual papers for you to be able to look through it. And, in the days not too long ago, they'd bring home their backpack on a Friday, and you'd clean it all out and see what was in there, and go through all the papers. And that's really not what's going on anymore. Everything's being done online. So parents really need to make sure that they're paying attention to the assignments that their kids are getting.
So are you looking ahead to, college and university for your kids and wondering what you should advise?
My oldest children that have already graduated from high school, they decided not to go that route because of the stuff that was being taught in the university. They didn't want to have to deal with it. My next child does want to, because he plays sports, and that's a big deal for him. And he wants to be able to continue that, and so he is looking at it. So we're being very, very careful on which universities and colleges we're looking at for him.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to talk with you, Tammy.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for watching The Nation Speaks. Be sure to join us at our usual time. That's every Saturday from 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, thanks for watching.